And thanks for each of you for being here today, for your curiosity about my political concept, namely spiritual democracy. Now, unlike the other presentations, I believe that my concept is the only one with the word democracy in it. However, my focus is largely on the adjective or the modifier, spiritual. Here, spiritual, when I use the word spiritual, it's intended to indicate something about the form of democracy that I will present, really the form of democracy that I will advocate for, champion. Spiritual democracy, it seems to me, is needed, is called for in the age of the catastrophic. So what is the shape, the form, the texture of spiritual democracy? Well, spiritual democracy is a lively, culturally specific, culturally contested, and progressive form of democracy that is both real and aspirational. Spiritual democracy is not a mystical, nationalistic political body, nor is it a democracy based on supposed transcendent or immutable ideals. Spiritual here, when linked to democracy, connotes the thought, skills, practices, dispositions, affect, and visions of diverse individuals and communities as they pursue distinctively democratic relationships, including relationships to ancestors, future generations, and the entities and beings of the more than human, of the natural world. So spiritual, the way I'm using it in this context, refers to the integrative complexity of people and place, forms of knowledge and wisdom, practice and affect, gratitude and reciprocity, the whole person in ethical, democratic interwovenness of people and place, an interwovenness that weaves together the past, present, and future, bringing attentiveness to voices of loss and voices of beauty. This democratic interwovenness of people and place requires an extension and a transformation of democratic commitments from the dignity of the human person and flourishing human communities to the dignity and flourishing of non-human creatures, entities, and communities. And democratic interwovenness entails listening to and witnessing the hauntings of places and ancestors such that their prophetic voices might be heeded, their emancipatory power released, their crying out for renovated futurities acknowledged. Spiritual democracy is not primarily understood as a democratic set of democratic procedures or legal codes, but neither is it bereft of procedural justice or such democratic principles as one person, one vote. Still, its scope is not limited to elections or procedures. Spiritual democracy follows Thoreau when he wrote, "Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence." In Thoreau's view, what was ailing the U.S. democracy was not so much a lack of formal democratic institutions, however important those are. I mean, those are really important. But in Thoreau's view, it wasn't only lack of formal democratic institutions, but rather a dearth of wild democratic spirit and character. How else were citizens of his time to confront the most profound threats to a genuine democracy? Racism, manifest destiny, capitalistic markets, and the commodification and exploitation of the natural world. Spiritual democracy's scope, then, is not limited to elections and procedures, but rather includes the manners and character of its diverse, progressive, wild citizens and communities. Now, descriptively, spiritual democracy refers to a dynamically constructed legacy of progressive movements, figures, practices, and aspirations that extends into the present and that listens to the future. Normatively, it refers to a dynamically constructed cultural and aesthetic space with which to identify and from which to critique the ways and manners of the nation, even as spiritual democracy itself is subject to critique. Spiritual democracy, then, is a progressive set of cultural and aesthetic manners characters, and visions of democracy. Now, I should make it clear that spiritual democracy is not identical to the democratic nation. It is one among many possible normative stances within democracy. Moreover, spiritual democracy does not place a premium on religion or on secularity per se. Spiritual democracy is secular insofar as when participating in the public and political realm, citizens do not assume that others necessarily share their religious perspectives or their perspectives on religion. Also, citizens do not treat religious perspectives in public debate as a special case subject to special exclusion or special privilege. Okay, so I hope I've provided something of a sketch of spiritual democracy, and now I'll fill in that sketch a bit. Spiritual democracy engenders what may be referred to as a democratic second nature, that is, the cultivation of an ecologically responsive, progressive democratic subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Second nature is the formative, dynamic process of acquiring in time and space various beliefs, practices, and dispositions that become appropriately internalized, for example, not blindly internalized. Progressive democratic second nature must be subject to constant critique and transformation. Indeed, critique itself is a cultivated capacity in spiritual democracy's second nature. The implicit argument here is that progressive democratic thought and action are not only compatible with the ways of cultivation, tradition, practice, celebration, and exemplars, but require them. For some time now, I've been interested in models of democratic institutions and practice that do not rely on either appeals to rational choice or market efficiency models, often purportedly derived from principles of universal deliberative human rationality, or political arguments based on natural reason or any other anchors in supposed ahistorical moral reality. My interest, rather, is in exploring models that describe progressive democracy as liberatory sociocultural work, whether at the local, national, or international, transnational level. To acknowledge the socio-historical nature of democratic achievements, however limited those may be, is also to acknowledge the fragility of those achievements. By recognizing the social cultural ways and manners of spiritual democracy, we can purposely attend to and cultivate a dynamic democratic second nature and identity or subjectivity that combats such democratic threats as white supremacy, misogyny, and environmentally destructive forms of anthropocentrism. Now, it remains an open question whether a progressive democracy can be achieved or the extent to which it can be approximated, a society and form of government marked by justice, freedom, and equality, and liberated from such harms as racism, patriarchy, homophobia, oligarchy, and the wanton indifference to the more than human world, harms that seem to be becoming more blatant and crushing each day. The theme of this year's conference is the double entendre, the ends of democracy, and surely the prospect of democracy's death, at least in the US, seems increasingly like an open question. This is not to suggest that democracy in the US was ever alive and well. Still, as I recently heard it put, we'll know it when we lose it. Spiritual democracy acknowledges the real possibility of the end of democracy, democracy, a frail sociocultural achievement, creation that can collapse faster than it emerged. But spiritual democracy also participates in the struggle to shore up and transform democracies. In other words, spiritual democracy serves the ethical ends, the aims of democracy. Now, in light of the current colossal threats to democracy, it might seem naive to champion spiritual democracy. But I worry that it is more naive to think a democracy can be achieved and sustained without giving more attention to democratic progressive culture and aesthetics, to its affect and social practices, including social practices of care and healing, its grieving, and its celebrations. A progressive democracy, I've said, requires arguments, principles, and public reasoning, yes, but much more as well. I'm not interested in reducing political theory to sociology, moral deliberation to historical inquiry, or social criticism to social engineering, but I am interested in bringing attention to the importance of the spiritual, integrative complexity of people in place, the socio-historical and material character of democratic beliefs, practices, and institutions. Now, when I speak of spiritual democracy as the integrative complexity of people in place, I have in mind something like what Walt Whitman called, quote, a sublime and serious religious democracy, namely the many and diverse cultural threads that form a complex, progressive, democratic social fabric. This intricate weave, in Whitman's view, is composed of poetry and pottery, literature and carpentry, opera and folk songs, philosophy and masonry, old and young, women and men, and I'm sure Whitman would add, queer, trans, and non-binary individuals. For each member of society is called on to contribute uniquely to the complex weave of the emerging spiritual democracy. This public engagement in building spiritual democracy does not bring this diminishment of individuality, but rather its flourishing. Whitman maintained that, quote, unquote, a greater product, the sacred forms of shared democratic life results when individuals participate in and not merely compete in an inclusive and lively public life. When Whitman wrote of a sublime and serious religious democracy, he was referring to what he called the third stage in the development of the U.S. democracy. The first stage is the development of democratic legal rights as expressed, for example, in the Constitution. The second stage is the material basis for daily living as exhibited, for example, by railways, farming, newspapers, schools, and monetary currency. The third stage is the development of what Whitman called religious democracy, what I'm calling the spiritual basis of a progressive democracy, namely its socio-cultural matrix. Whitman's hope was in a plural, dynamic, democratic forms of life, inclusive of a wide variety of human experience, expression, and ways of being. While he never slighted the significance of achieving equal franchise or elected government, the ongoing work of stage one, he maintained that there is a, quote unquote, a deeper, higher progress, one which reaches down into the manners and characters of a society as well as into the life of the individual. Whitman's verse in Leaves of Grass can be interpreted as a poetic expression of what he called religious democracy. The very title of this collection of poems, Leaves of Grass, invokes the notion of honoring distinct and diverse individuality, private paths, each blade of grass, as well as collectivities, public paths, the solidarities of the various weaves. Pursuing spiritual democracy is not, I have said, a venture in discovering a single fixed national moral identity. Rather, it is a journey into discovering how rich identities fed by diverse streams can also be fed by shared visions of who we can become, forging solidarities, communities, bringing diverse backgrounds and perspectives to the work of combating fascism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. To that end, we can draw on and contribute to a diverse repertoire of public democratic rituals, practice, and stories, forms of healing and caring. We can draw on powerful exemplars and symbols found in such movements as the abolitionist movements, women's suffrage and feminist movements, Black Power and Black Lives Matter, farm workers, indigenous peoples, pro-choice, anti-nuclear, LGBTQ plus movements, Occupy Wall Street, disability rights, and environmental justice movements. These movements represent a diversity of achievements that are worth celebrating. Celebration, too, belongs to spiritual democracy. And yet, again and again, we are reminded of, and should be reminded of, the fragility of such achievements. And again, we are haunted by and should be haunted by the loss and suffering of those whose lives were supposed to have been honored and protected and ameliorated by such achievements. The fragility of our collective work and achievements, the persistence of injustice and the attendant sorrow, and the fatigue and dismay that violent backlash is producing, are all sensible reasons for warranted despair. Still, in the face of such despair, spiritual democracy seeks to cultivate a variety of wild and radical dispositions. Hope is one of those dispositions. In spiritual democracy, hope is a disposition and practices that nourishes efforts to form solidarities and to work toward life-affirming practices despite warranted despair and evidence that enduring change, while possible, may not be likely. We do not need to choose between hope and despair, between positive affects and bad feelings. Despair is certainly called for when faced with settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, homo-transphobia, patriarchy, and the massive exploitation of the more than human. Spiritual democracy honors and cultivates a wide set of complex dispositions and affective responses, including hope, wonder, reverence, and love, as well as despair, grief, irreverence, and rage. Regarding hope, its particular form in spiritual democracy is exemplified in the life and work of W.E.B. Du Bois. It is not a cheerful denial of cheerless facts, nor is it faith in inevitable progress. It is rather hope as a social practice and disposition that is informed by suffering and loss, by uncertainty and vulnerability. Another disposition and practice central to spiritual democracy is the cultivation of democratic enhanced attention as it is joined to praxis-oriented empathy. Praxis-oriented empathy is a disposition and practice that motivates and accompanies the witnessing of social harms and the practical work of social justice and transformation. Such empathy is a form of care and also a form of critique. Caring about suffering requires commitment to critiquing and dismantling structures and practices of injustice. Practice-oriented empathy is not sentimental sympathy. Sentimental sympathy is a disposition and affect that grants an individual deep feeling, but entails no attending practical consequences. It is similar to what Saidiya Hartman refers to as the gaze, or the voyeur, or the spectator. The work of praxis-oriented empathy, in contrast, nurtures accountability and action in those who seek to combat various causes of suffering and oppression. Now, I invoked Whitman's title and poem, Leaves of Grass, to suggest something of the vast diversity of the weaves that make up spiritual democracy. Yet who belongs to a democracy has always been a contested question. Who's included and who is excluded? Undocumented people, all children born and raised in the US, trans people, and this group too, ancestors. Are ancestors members of our communities, members of our democracy? What difference might it make to include ancestors or to exclude them? Spiritual democracy seeks to be receptive to all the voices of the land, including those of ancestors. Now, the practice of honoring, attending, listening to ancestors is common among indigenous groups around the world. Indigenous ancestors provide palpable sources of life, offering comfort in ways of resilience and sovereignty. The Potawatomi scholar Kyle White describes imaginative intergenerational dialogues between indigenous ancestors, present participants, and future descendants. Intergenerational dialogues that seek to guide and empower Indigenous peoples in the face of various forms of oppression. As Kyle White describes it, the intergenerational dialogue between past ancestors and future descendants would address, quote, what actions we or our communities ought to take to respond to the issues and problems that characterize our current situation. Euro-Americans, in contrast to Indigenous communities, tend not to listen to their ancestors. Yet if the ancestors are silenced, a democracy will not be able to receive their stories. And without the stories, to quote the Laguna Pueblo author Leslie Silko, without the stories, you don't have anything. So the question is how to include ancestors of all kinds as members of our communities and our democracies. How to have reciprocal intergenerational relationships with them. How to receive their stories. The first step is to be receptive to active ancestors, recognizing them in other cultures, and listening for them in your own. Spiritual democracy seeks to ask what ancestors, for example, do Euro-Americans have, and what stories do they bring? The practice of listening to ancestors would entail something like a critical piety, acknowledging the presence of ancestors, listening to their voices, but not uncritically following them. Ancestors are no more or less trustworthy than some of the living who would attempt to wield power by feigning to speak on their behalf, thereby legitimating all kinds of harm. All voices should be welcomed into vibrant, agonistic democratic discourse and debate, even as all voices should be subject to critique. If the settler cultures in the US welcomed ancestors, perhaps one would hear the voice of settler ancestors who would acknowledge what Kyle White has called their ancestral fantasy, the expansion of US territory and the concomitant elimination, culturally, politically, physically, of Native Americans. It is of the utmost importance that a democracy acknowledge all of its ancestors, even those who have perpetuated racial violence and oppression. Acknowledging such ancestors would entail witnessing, grieving, and taking actions to seek to address the cruel harm caused by these ancestors. Of course, a nation must also recognize and honor those ancestors who courageously opposed the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Some Euro-American ancestors would no doubt be among those courageous ancestors. However, it would be especially important for the US to listen to and honor the voices of Indigenous ancestors who suffered from and resisted violent settler colonialism. One cannot assume, of course, that Indigenous ancestors would choose to participate in a US intergenerational democratic dialogue, but if some did, one might hear, among other things, the stories of Indigenous ancestral dystopia, the exploitation and elimination of their peoples and lands, and perhaps one would hear of their ancestral fantasies too, dwelling in a land in which they experience political and cultural sovereignty, including the ability to exercise care for and to be accountable to the more than human. In spiritual democracy, listening to, being receptive to the ancestors must entail witnessing, grieving, and taking specific actions, for example, such as return of land, that would endeavor to respond to the ruinous, unjust deeds of the past. Insofar as the seemingly powerless and voiceless are excluded from democratic regard and care, a democracy neglects its responsibility to include and consider the entire community. Thus far, I have mainly discussed the entire community in terms of humans and ancestors. Yet spiritual democracy advocates receptivity not only to human communities and ancestors, but also to the more than human. Just as co-creating a new future with ancestors requires receptivity to them, so too with the presences of the more than human. What might it mean to truly listen to those of the more than human, to be receptive to them, and in turn to co-create with them. Leslie Silko's work depicts the profound struggle and resilience of Indigenous people as they work to establish home and belonging under conditions of displacement and loss of sovereignty. And that struggle and resilience is supported by and assisted by engagement with the more than human. Silko presents an Indigenous perspective of the palpable, powerful otherness and agency of the more than human. Although other, these non-human agents interact with humans, often intimately, and some even have kinship relationships with human communities. If we would be co-creators, creating just transitions and seeking justice and caring relations with the more than human, then democracies need to be open to, need to be receptive to, the powerful otherness and agency of the more than human. While it is humans who are accountable to justice and to goodness, the scope and reach of justice and goodness extends beyond the human. Spiritual democracy seeks to cultivate a caring attentiveness to the webs of life in which we are embedded. Without this lens of attentiveness, of care, humans remain oblivious to the intricate, more than human life and agency all around us, that of trees and plants, animal and fish, rivers and mountains. We move through the world seeking control and domination over that which we deem as dead and inert and without agency. And all the while, as we ravage and exploit the more than human, we trash the atmosphere for gains so short term that their span of time can be measured by a single ancient tree. Spiritual democracy then seeks to cultivate a creative attentiveness to the ways of the more than human, including them in democratic deliberation, institutions, affect, and practice. We must learn to listen even to the stones, for stones have much to teach us. The non-human agencies of stones challenges the human illusion that we are at the center of all things, sovereign and independent, forever dominating and controlling. If we can learn to listen to stones, we may be able to hear much else as well. Stones and ancestors, then, are among the members and teachers of a spiritual democracy. So in conclusion, as they say, I know we're all greatly distressed about reactionary leaders and movements, reactionary forms of culture that are fostering fascism, oligarchy, and other anti-democratic energies in the US and around the globe. Against those, we need not only arguments, but opposing movements and forms of culture, ways of being, feeling, thinking, listening, attending, caring, mobilizing, ways of spiritual democracy. A challenge, however, is that those on the left, those committed to progressive democracy, tend to be suspicious of anything like spiritual democracy, that is, of shared ways of being and belonging, cultivated dispositions and practices, public rites and ceremonies. Yet, if we would stop consigning something like the mineshaft to the past or to the political right, stop viewing it as an anomaly in modernity, we may worry less about the very idea of spiritual democracy, that is, of the integrated forms of knowledge and wisdom, practice and affect, gratitude and reciprocity expressed in the we and the I of a democratic interwovenness, where the we is inclusive of ancestors and the more than human, and the I is inclusive of the expansive, dynamic universe of diverse selves. If we are to work toward a progressive democracy, we cannot afford to neglect or dispense with the integrative complexity of people in place with something like spiritual democracy. Thank you.